Thank you for the graveyard shift. I did agree to it. And part of it was because I'm not the dementia expert. However, one of the things that I have been committed in doing over the past 2 years is really looking at consumer-directed care. And particularly, I was fortunate enough in 2011, 2012 to have a Churchill Fellowship, and I travelled the world looking at all the different consumer-directed care models, including the UK and Scotland, looking at Canada, looking at the States and looking at New Zealand. So I came back thinking, oh my God, what a journey that we're on. And I liked aspects of it, but no one really got it right. So part of my passion is to guide people to make the most out of life. And in looking at that passion, in working with the organisation I'm working with now, which is RSL Care in Queensland, that has Queensland and New South Wales services, is how we can, through consumer-directed care, guide and facilitate others to make the most out of life. So one of the good things in going last is that I don't need to say a lot because it's been said, and there's been absolutely wonderful themes that have been going through and channeling through today and some discourse. However, being the last speaker, you do need to turn some things on their head. I think that CDC is a method of service delivery that does enable clients to have a greater voice, and Heather and others spoke about the importance of empowering, enabling. Even Jason indicated how important it is for them to have a voice. I want to actually take that one step further, and I think Jason alluded to it. CDC is a product to be bought and sold. It is really around the customer has total power. And for Australia in our sector, that's what we're going to have to think about as we move forward with our organisations. We know that as a policy perspective, the government is indicating that it should focus on wellness and re-enablement, and we know that that pretty much is a labour market decision in the context that we want people to be healthier as they grow older, so they're not such a burden on our health system. So we've got to realise that there's an undertone there and a paradigm there from a government perspective. However, I think that as providers, we also need to understand what it really means from not just being person-centred, but actually being customer-centric. And I think that that's a challenge that I also want to speak about as we go through this presentation. And I think that the biggest issue around that is the individual's control over their finances. In Australia, we are a little bit timid, I think, in our policy perspectives around CDC, because we aren't giving total control to the customer, and the customer being, the client. So when you actually have a look at it, and COJA has done, there's around about 4 or 5 pages, which I haven't shared with you, but have a look at what COJA's got available from the differences between the traditional areas of service delivery to a person-centred approach to what is consumer-directed. And I think that that's one of the challenging things that we need to look at. Person-centred, as we've talked about today, is allocation of block funding still to the provider. So in our CDC approach, we're still allocating the funding to you as the provider. In a true CDC approach, the funding would go to the customer, the client, and they would choose where they would actually spend those funds. So Australia at this stage isn't necessarily fully transparent, only transparent in how we spend the funds. My concern in this, if we're really true around what we're trying to achieve, is that the customer, we are more transparent on how we spend the funds, but are we truly giving the customer total control? And I think that that's something that we need to ask ourselves in our approach in CDC, particularly around decision making. In person-centred, you'll have fees charged and may be waived by the provider, whereas fees for the services are set and applied in our CDC approach. So that transparency of how we're actually going to cost out or price. Remembering this is not necessarily a cost model, it's what you price your services as. That's particularly important in a CDC approach. And one of the things I think as we go along and we consider around the time that we may need to spend with customers that are living with dementia, is how you're going to price that as far as your CDC package. Are you going to price it that there's extra time that you're going to spend, or due to the fact that your administration cost of price that you're only going to give them 2 hours to sit down and work out a budget, a plan, and what their needs, wants and outcomes are, that you're going to actually, fit that into the administration's costs. So these are the sorts of things that you're going to have to start to think about because of the needs, the wants and differences of working with customers, all customers, and particularly those living with dementia. Some other bits and pieces is around that role of a planner or facilitator and your role. And I think that there has been a theme today about facilitation, guiding and supporting people and their families in that experience around dementia and what's happening with them. And so that power and control is different in guiding and supporting to actually doing to or suggesting. And one of the things that I find really interesting in the language that we use and the sorts of things that we've even talked about today, sometimes we're still in that mindset of providing a menu of services. We have our domestic, our personal care services, our cottage respite, our social support, all these sorts of menus of services that we may have priced up that you can select from in your CDC journey. Is that truly customer-centric? It might be person-centered, but the control and power still lies with us as providers and as individuals because all we're doing is selecting from that menu. So we need to challenge ourselves, and what I liked about the linkage presentation is that you can see the creativeness of what you were trying to do in that, what you are doing in that model around working with the individual. And so when you start to price that up, you have to think about in a CDC world of what that looks like. And so that's going to be an interesting challenge. However, there's ways to do it. And I think that that's the sort of thing that we really need to put our hands on our hearts and start to think about as we go down this journey. Moving on. So we know from today that every speaker has said that the individual and their families should participate in the journey. It really is around where the power and control sits is the primary difference. We can be person-centered but still have the power and control sitting with us. We can still be working holistically with the individual around their well-being outcomes, around improving their quality of life, but still have the power and control sitting with us as we guide and facilitate those individuals through their journey with us. So if we're true around CDC, if we really want to make that difference of moving to a customer-centric model, it's really around the direction comes from those individuals. The power control fully sits with the person living with dementia and their family. So it's their journey, not our journey. It's their choices and the direction they wish to take, and it's their outcomes path. We are there to guide and facilitate and ensure that we support making it happen with the defined resources in the budget that we've got. So I think that that's one of the key messages that has been great to go through today with all the speakers. I find it interesting, even in the coaching material, that this is the latest material. I don't know whether you all know that on their website now they're trying to find free materials for people to actually utilise, and it's really interesting that they put up a diagram that goes from person-centred to consumer-directed, and then they use person-centred in some other materials. So that discourse, I think we are struggling with as an industry that we need to work through. Even so, it is about an individual. It is about the person. It's about the planning and the approaches and working together on that. Some of the things that COTA have also looked at is about then looking at the individual, about I am, I want, the support, knowing, working with me, and that sense of future and hope. And I think that again has been a theme that we've been going through today, that it is about the individual and ensuring that the language is particularly important and the power and control sits with that individual. One of the tools that I really enjoyed in my travels was the talking approach from Scotland, and I really liked it because it was simple. We often overcomplicate things in community aged care, and I think that the more simple we can make it for our staff, the easier it is to actually understand, and there's been great examples of how that can happen today, and some thinking around that. However, I will take up Dawn's offer of developing tools, because as we go along, I went searching for tools other than your own to say I can't duplicate, and it was really difficult to find, robust tools that a planner, facilitator, case manager can actually utilise out there while they're having that conversation. It was a struggle. So this model is built on the exchange model, and Heather spoke about that of SMILE, and I think that was particularly important about having other people's point of view. So we come with our perspective and point of view. The GP, the health, the ACAT team comes with their point of view. The family have their own point of view, and then the individual living with dementia has a point of view. And so our role is to guide and facilitate that conversation, because everything is in the conversation. And how do we actually guide that conversation and all those points of view? Our role is to then negotiate with them around the outcome and looking at then around the services that would actually assist them to meet that outcome. So that's how the exchange model works. Outcomes is a little bit of a new language in Australia, but you'll find that in HAC we've worked with outcomes a lot, but outcomes in the HAC world have only just been how many services you're delivering. So it's really outputs. Outcomes for a person living with dementia is how are the interventions or the services or supports that you're actually providing them are helping them to improve, enhance their well-being and quality of life. And how are you going to measure that? How do you know that you've been successful? It's not how many hours of domestic assistance that's being delivered, or personal care, or respite, or any of those things. How do you know that you're enhanced their quality of life? So through a CDC package, it should be easier to do that because we have flexibility, and they should be more in control of what's being delivered. So being able to utilise that exchange model in there of actually exchanging all of that and coming out with the outcomes that that individual wishes to achieve and to support their family. So you have an outcomes-focused conversation. Re-enablement or enablement and restoration is actually an output. It's an end result of everything. You implement the plan and then you review it. But as I've indicated, in doing all of that, it needs to ensure that it's meeting the outcomes of the individual. And I know that Silverchain have done some work around this internally, and they shared that, some of their researchers shared that with me, and it was really difficult. There's some work in New Zealand looking at outcomes, but it is very difficult to measure. So that's a struggle for us as we move forward. Ooh. So, how I've been asked to then talk about engagement, and I wanted to go at the end because, as I said, I'm not the expert in this area. However, we know that it's all in the conversation, as it's been said today. It needs to be the voice of the individual and how we are actually going to gain that. So the ways that we communicate is critically important, and how our case managers, coordinators communicate is imperative. I've said in the organisation I'm with at the moment that they are the most important people. They are the key to CDC. And if they do not have the skills and the ability to communicate, think creatively, be flexible and engage, then we're not going to succeed as an organisation. We've talked about today that communication is about conveying that message and about talking and exchanging. We've talked about today, the speakers have talked about the importance of individuals living with dementia, their feelings, their emotions, and listening to them. Listening, I think Heather said, with the whole body, not just the head. I can't remember, there's been so many speakers. But how important that is in that engagement. Are we fully there? Are we there to guide, or are we there to just say, okay, I'm listening and here's the menu of services that I'm getting you to select from? There's a difference. And that's why I like some of the work of the linkage program, because you could see in that program they were listening. They were building that rapport, and the solutions that they came up with were really about that individual to guide them to what outcomes they wanted to achieve. So we've also talked about some of the difficulties in communication that we need to be aware of, particularly with people living with dementia and some of those challenges. And I think that, I reflected today on some of the staff that, I have. I mean, I only look after one region. I look after 50 million. Yes, I'm a bean counter. And I have 600 staff. And I think that, wow, can I put my hand on my heart and say that they fully engage with each of our customers in residential care, community care, and retirement living that I'm responsible for? Can't do it. So it really is, important that we all reflect and be honest. I think that taking the time to actually engage, have the conversation, listen, as Heather says, with our whole body, is time. And in CDC, one of the most fearful things that we have is time we're scared of, because time costs. So how are we going to price our time? So it comes back to all of our speakers have spoken about value. What's important to the individual customer? What do they value? And if they value time, if they value the time that you sit down to have a cup of tea with them, to truly understand what they're wanting, what they're needing, and what they're trying to achieve out of life now and into the future, then if that takes time, then so be it, because in consumer-directed care, they're paying for it. And so one of the transparent things that I've done in the development, I was lucky enough to be the one developing the model for our organisation, is that we've priced our time. Right up front, we've indicated in our model that it's going to be this much for our time for this particular worker. And each worker has a price in time. So it doesn't matter how much time they purchase of that particular worker, that's their choice. So it's not a menu of products and services. There's ideas around that, because some people like to know, what's available and the sorts of things that could be available, but what they're purchasing is time. And I think that that's an interesting concept as we look at, that decision-making process and working with people with dementia. I need to look at my slides and that, because I just make it up as I go along often. So the other thing that I think that's particularly important is that has been one of the key themes coming through today is learning about dementia, its progress and its effects on the individual, because I think that knowledge to help that communication process. I think one of the most important aspects and key messages of today is that communication is possible. Along people's life journey, communication and decision-making is possible. And I think the other thing that is important is focusing on people's abilities and strengths. We didn't necessarily hear a lot of that today, but that's what it's about. It's about, and in some ways we did talk about it, but not necessarily focusing on people's strengths and abilities, but we did. The examples that were provided were definitely examples about strength-based planning. What can you do now? What you can continue to do? Because we did talk about, when we took that away, how people felt, it was very meaningless for them. So I think it is important that we focus on what people can do and can continue to do, and what they would like to do and how we can enhance that. So it is about the person, and I'm even flicking from that discourse to person to customer-centric, But I wanted to throw customer-centric at you because I think that as we move forward, as health and aged care becomes a commodity to be bought and sold, we need to start to think that this is a customer-centric approach as well. So in focusing on the person, it really is, as we've said today, is in promoting their individual choice. And how are you going to do that? It's about identifying and building on their strengths. It's about looking at what they can do now. It's about encouraging and enabling them to achieve the goals that's important to them now and the future. It's about support. It's about guiding, and it's about facilitating. So that's great. We've had that for the last 6 hours. How the hell are we going to do this? I went around the world to have a look. So Dawn gave us one excellent model today, which is really easy to remember. And then I did a bit of a scan to say, okay, well, what else is out there? I knew what was out there from a consumer-directed voice. I didn't know necessarily what was really out there from, people living with dementia. This technique here was interesting. So Carolyn thought, oh my God, technique, therapy. We had this little dialogue going. And it really shows you that, the world itself is still coming from necessarily a medical model. And so one of the things I always say to people is that because you're living with dementia doesn't mean you're actually sick. And I think that that's really important. I mean, I shared a little story today with someone is that, in my role, I actually, even the last 24 hours, I've had 3 residents abscond. I've had so many reportable assaults. Think of that language, right? One of those residents is a frequent absconder from one of my residential facilities. And you know why he's absconding? Because every Friday afternoon he goes to the pub. So every Friday, I have no idea how he knows it's a Friday, but every Friday he goes to the pub. And I said to them after around 3 weeks of this happening, he's a new resident, I said, so what's the problem? And they said, well, he goes to the pub. I go, yeah, so take him to the pub. He goes to the pub, he has his schooner, and he comes back, and that's what he wants to do. So that enablement and facilitating of that is thinking outside the box, thinking outside the square, being creative, understanding what his needs and wants are in a residential facility. Rather than, that escalation process of absconding, calling the police, calling the family, calling the GP, and, coming from a medical base. So this technique here, I still think is a little bit behavioural oriented. So it's really focusing on the person living with dementia's behaviour. And it talks about emotion, thoughts and feelings. It talks about the listening and emotional messages that are behind that. And that's really good. And then it uses this language called redirection. Not quite sure about that. The redirection is really looking at redirection from both positive redirection, and I'll just find my notes here so I actually give it reference. Oh, you'll love this. Negative redirection and positive redirection. So negative redirection is ignoring what the person is trying to tell you. So we know that is negative, and that did come through as a theme today. Whereas positive redirection validates and joins in on what the person is thinking and feeling. So they talk about 4 steps in redirection, validating the person's reality. I like that this is their reality, this is what's important to them, thinking and feeling, joining the person where they are and listening to their point of view. Through listening to the point of view, you'll actually gain a lot from it's like the story work we do around their thoughts, their feelings, and what's important to them. This bit's really interesting. They then talk about distract the person by pointing their attention to somewhere else. That's really not what we're trying to achieve here. and redirecting them by engaging them in other activities. So you can see that this technique is really premised around that what we consider as behaviour management. However, there's some good aspects to take out of that, and particularly some of the key messages around not arguing with people, listening to the message and finding meaning. I think that's a good takeaway, and allowing the person with dementia to express themselves. I think that's a good takeaway as well. One of the things that I found in the Scottish model, and I'm not quite sure, Dawn, where your research has looked at this in any form much, is around the talking mats. And we had a little bit of a go at this, particularly if people were finding it more difficult to express themselves, on how we could empower people around that decision making. And so we started to trial the talking mats, and we've had it with mixed success. So I think it really is for us learning how to utilise this as an engagement tool. But the most important thing is trying to empower people around that decision making. So one of the research here, and this is a Scottish group, they looked at 34 people. That were interviewed using the talking mat method. They compared the effectiveness of having a constructive conversation with then the talking mat and the conversation approach. And they actually found that by using a combination of the conversation and the talking mat, that people were empowered in their decision making and were able to make decisions no matter what part or stage of their journey with living with dementia. And so I think that that's a really powerful tool if we can assist. They did find that if people were in more advanced stages, they may need support to actually place the card or the thing onto the mat and be guided by that. But other than that, they found that people were quite capable and able to make decisions on how they were feeling and what services they would like access to. So I think this is something in Australia we could really, start to explore a little bit more. So the most important thing, though, is particularly around nonverbal communication, is really knowing your client, the customer in this. And so in everything that we do, I think that's particularly important. So it's a low-tech communication tool and helps people in different stages in dementia to express their views and their opinions. It's a system of pictures and symbols that allow people to indicate their feelings about a subject by placing the relevant image below a visual scale. So you have their happy, not sure, unhappy. And what they do is they talk about it in activities, relationships or people, the environment, and them themselves. And so I like that because it's a guided conversation, and it shows that we're not the ones also thinking, oh, okay, we've got enough information, we know their needs and their wants, let's look at, what services we can provide. So I think that that's an interesting way. They found that it enables people with dementia to communicate their views, needs and preferences. And I think that's particularly what we're trying to achieve in CDC, particularly around decision making and guiding that decision making. The research found that the use of the talking mats more effectively than just a structured or unstructured conversation allowed people with dementia to communicate their views about their well-being, about how they're feeling now and what's happening for them. The other advantages in using it as a tool, they found that talking mats help people to stay on track and to make themselves understood. So again, it's an empowering tool that, this is what I want to talk about. They proved it especially useful when making a difficult decision, and they used the example in the research of someone looking at whether they can continue driving or not. So it was almost like the pros and cons of what was happening for them in that in that time in their lives. And also, sometimes when we engage in conversations with people with living with dementia or any of our clients, it's a long, protracted protracted hour or 2 hours we're with them. Can't even remember what happened in the last 30 minutes, let alone an hour. So this was a way that you could actually remember what was going on earlier in the conversation and not losing track. So it's very empowering in that way. As I said, there's 3 types of symbols and pictures that they use. So they then had the activities, music, reading, clubs and groups. So they used a combination of words and symbols as it related to the individual can actually relate to on a topic. The interesting things for me is that the danger that we would have is having the scope and breadth and depth of the cards to enable that creative solutions. Otherwise, we go back to this is the menu of services and these are the only things that you can actually do. So I think that that's a risk in this. However, if it's a conversation piece and we've got some flexibility in the cards and what we do, that would be, or it could be clubs and groups, and then you engage through conversation around the type of clubs and groups that are important to you, your life story, work, and those sorts of things. Interestingly enough, they actually trialled the white background and the yellow background, and they found that around about 50-50 people liked the yellow or the white background and related to that. So that was interesting. The other thing that I liked about this and what we were trying to do is actually experiment in the engagement model. So when you think about the engagement model, you're getting the points of views of the carers, the families, the husband and wives. You're getting the point of view of the GP. You're coming with your perspective from an assessed, need perspective. And then you've got the actual person living with dementia's point of view. Often, they're not getting a voice, really. Right? So this way is one way of giving them a voice and actually saying, well, hold on, when your role is to guide and facilitate the negotiation of what's going to become part of that CDC package, you can go back and say, wait a minute, Joy or Ben or whoever it is actually indicated that this is what they like to do, even if the family member's thinking they should be doing this. So it's, that's how I see it could be utilised, empowering decision-making with the actual client. One of the things that we need to come up with here is around the creative solutions. And I think that the talking mats is one way. As I said, I was impressed today with all the different sorts of ways that we're trying to come up with creative solutions that are person-centred. And Jason brought it up around dignity of risk. Dignity of risk is one of the things as organisations that we really need to struggle with. Whether we do the high cleaning, and I've got services on the other end of the Australia that now have hack services just for high cleaning. They've cornered a market, Believe it or not, I'm working with a hotel services guy and he said, Tracey, there's all these contraptions that you just, you bend, you do this and all the rest of it for manual handling that you can do high cleaning anywhere you want. But of course, we're just in our tunnel, in our bubble. We're not thinking about those things. So one of the biggest challenges, as I've said, in consumer-directed care, once you actually understand what it is, the outcomes that that individual wants to achieve out of that package, what are the creative solutions that you're going to come up with them in co-creation? So remembering that empowerment, you're co-creating together. At this point in time, we have a voice as providers, but for me, it's around co-creating together the solutions. Just quickly, because I know that my body thinks it's actually 7 o'clock and the red wine's flowing. Some of the other ideas that they've come up with is emotional touch points. So we've looked at that. I thought this was really interesting technique around listening. So if you're listening as a whole person, as a whole body, whether you're actually picking up where there is, language that's maybe not so positive, or whether there's non-verbal communication that's not so positive, and where you're picking up language that is more positive. And I think that that's an interesting way to start start to look at things, and using a mat again. So this part was around storytelling in the context of actually looking at what they liked about the respite centre that they were going to. And so by looking at those stories, they picked up some of the language in that and how important that language is to feeling comfortable, vulnerable, they were formed, relieved. So you can start to look, what are the outcomes of that centre or the outcomes of that experience for that person living with dementia. And it also helps inform where are they at now with what their environment is. So if you're using this as a technique, sitting down, having the conversation when putting someone onto a CDC or converting someone to a CDC package, it'd be interesting to sit down and listen if they've got services now about what's working for them. Because the other thing that I think is particularly important, and I'm not saying that carers and families aren't important, but what I know from my services and reflection, we tend to put them in for the household, not the individual. So we're putting the domestic assistance, which is important to keep the household running and functioning and giving the carer a break. But how much are we doing for that individual? The clothes are clean, the washing's done, the food's there, the housekeeping's there. We've given the carer a break on respite. But how many dollars are actually being spent improving the quality of life for that individual? So I think that's something that's important as we move forward around that decision making, around the balance, around keeping the household functioning, which is important for that individual as part of the household, but also what are we doing for them as individuals. So this is a way too to understand, words and how we can use those trigger words to understand where that individual is at this point in time, or from the services that we're providing into that household or they're part of, is it working for them? We can do that through the use of language. And that's all I had. Thank you.